Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to the virtual launch of the Canadian Shields Stories and Essays by Carol Shields, edited by Nora Foster Stovel. My name is Sarah Entz, and I'm the Promotions and Publicity Coordinator at the University of Manitoba Press. Oh, I just lost my. There we go. Our press is located on Treaty 1 territory and on the national homeland of the Red River Métis. But this afternoon we are gathering with people from far and wide, so welcome to all of you to this virtual space. I'm so glad that you are all able to join us for this celebration of Carol Shields. I'm going to share a 20% off code in the chat, which you can use if you want to buy the Canadian Shields directly from the U of M Press website. If you're doing any last minute holiday shopping, I'm of the opinion that the Canadian Shields would make a perfect gift. So that's an idea for you. I'll just pop it in the chat to everyone. So I have the link to the book as well as the discount code there. So it is my pleasure to introduce Nora Foster Stovel this afternoon. Nora Foster Stovel is Professor Emerita at the University of Alberta, where she taught in the Department of English and Film Studies. She has edited several collections on Carol Shields' writing, including the collected poetry of Carol Shields, relating Carol Shields' essays and fiction crossing borders, and also the focus of today's launch, the Canadian Shields. Nora has published extensively as well on Jane Austen, D.H. Lawrence, Margaret Drabble, and Margaret Lawrence, including Divining Margaret Lawrence, a study of her complete writings. Nora currently lives in Edmonton, Alberta, where her children, Laura and Grant, also reside. I will now welcome Nora to your screens. Replace spotlight. There we go. Take it away.
Thank you, Sarah, for that very, very generous introduction and also for hosting this virtual launch. And I'd like to welcome all of our guests and especially members of the Shields family, Dawn Shields, and four of Carol and Dawn Shields' grandchildren, Nicholas Giardini, Joseph Giardini, and Hazel and Eli, who have all very kindly agreed to read something, as will my own son, Grant Stovel, later, in case I forgot to mention that, Sarah. I'd like to thank all the members of the University of Manitoba Press, Director David Larson, Senior Editor Jill McConkey, who was the editor for this collection, her assistant Kyla Neufeld, Managing Editor Barbara Romaniak, Publicity Coordinator Sarah Enns. Did I get it right, Sarah? Marketing Supervisor Stephanie Patty, all of whom I had the pleasure of meeting in person at our in-person launch in Winnipeg in October. And also I'd like to thank our copy editor, Dallas Harrison, who did an excellent job as well. So what we're going to do today is first I'm going to, well, I guess I should say I chose the title the Canadian Shields rather mischievously. And so like a heavyweight boxer, I have to defend my title. So first of all, I'm going to do that. And that will involve something of a retrospective of Carol Shields' literary career. And then I will go on to talk about what's in this collection. And then fortunately, a number of people, including members of her family, one of her former students, have agreed to read short extracts from some of the items in this book to whet your appetites for further reading. And then finally, we will open up the discussion to the floor. Not sure if the net has a floor, but we'll find it in case any of the participants wish to ask questions or add comments. I think we have some Carol Shields experts on board, as well as many readers and admirers. So let me begin by defending my title, if that's all right, Sarah. So the question is, how did an American-born author become an award-winning Canadian writer? How did the denizen of Oak Park, Illinois, birthplace of Ernest Hemingway, become Winnipeg's Citizen of the Year? Well, Carol Ann Warner, as she was then, began the process by marrying a Canadian engineer, Donald Hugh Shields. And Dawn, would you like to tell us about how you met Carol? Or I could do it. You're muted.
I am unmuted now. I met Carol by chance by choosing the same Christmas course in England, and this was at the British Council at the time in 1955, 56, wanted to make sure that foreign students such as Carol and I were, Carol coming from Chicago and me from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, chose the same course, as I said, in Scotland, just north of Glasgow. And I remember we were, my two Canadian chums from Winnipeg and Saskatoon, arrived somewhat late on the day we were supposed to meet. And there was this lovely young woman wearing a green woolen dress, standing by a roaring fire at the inn where we were to stay. And naturally, I said hello, and went on from there because we had a week together just as students, and together there were about 25 or 30 of us traveling around. And so that's how I met Carol. And she wanted to be dropped off at in a place in Edinburgh at the end of the week that we were together. And I remember taking her little suitcase up to the apartment where she was staying. And I memorized Locus Hall, University of Exeter. And so I wrote to her naturally. And that was the start.
And the rest is history, as they say. And
Now,
would you like to tell us what her mother said to you when you left to set off for Canada?
No, Nora, I don't have a clue what her mother said.
She asked you to make sure that Carol continued her writing.
Oh.
And you said, her what?
You know it better than I do.
Yeah, so that I think maybe she wrote this rather than you. I'm not sure which of you wrote this to me, but that suggests that she was rather shy about her writing at that point. So I'll carry on with the process. The next step she took was crossing the 49th parallel with Dawn, her ironing board stowed in the back of their old blue Ford. There, she became a landed immigrant, and their wedding presents, plus her ironing board, became settlers' effects. Serendipitously, that was 1957, the year of the founding of the Canada Council, of which Carol Shields eventually became a valued member. Although Atwood said the 49th parallel is less the world's longest undefended border than its biggest one-way mirror, Shields found it a penetrable border, crossing it frequently, as do her protagonists Daisy Goodwill of the Stone Diaries and Larry Weller of Larry's Party. In a previously unpublished talk titled Coming to Canada in this collection, Carol Shields recalls people asking, wasn't it a terrible wrench to leave the country of your birth? But she was too much in love to care. Years later, I understood what it means to cross a border, she reports. Moving to a new country was like falling down a dark hole, but for a long while I was too busy to notice. Later, she admitted, this is perhaps one of the easiest immigrations in the world, but adds, nevertheless, it took me years to understand how things worked in my adopted country, the political system, the intricacies and pressures of geography, the Canadian character. Emigrating from the US to Canada as a young bride, she was puzzled by many questions. What was the difference between a prime minister and a premier? Kilometers and centimeters, Fahrenheit and Celsius. This is all from her essays, by the way, and interviews. What lay behind the mysterious initials, CBC, NRC, NFB? And she might have added SSHRC, which is the research arm of the Canada Council. Literary scholars, including Carol Shields, pronounce that acronym SHIRK, but I understand that theology scholars pronounce it shriek, perhaps as a result of all those Christian martyrs. Carol Shields acknowledges in her essay, The Feminine Line, I find as an immigrant, a woman fiction writer in midlife, that I have more questions than I have answers. She was puzzled by the joke, why did the Canadian cross the road? With the answer, to get to the middle. Atwood recalls a contest wherein contestants were challenged to invent a Canadian simile parallel to as American as apple pie. And I thought perhaps as Canadian as cranberry sauce might do. But the winning comparison was as Canadian as possible under the circumstances, a slogan that Atwood considered captured the essence of the Canadian psyche. Shields became officially Canadian by applying for citizenship in 1970, 13 years after her immigration. Her dual citizenship allowed her the distinction of being the only writer ever to be awarded the Governor General's Award for Fiction and the Pulitzer Prize. She accomplished this feat with the same novel, The Stone Diaries, reissued last year by Vintage Canada on the 30th anniversary of its initial publication. Shields became truly Canadian by living in Canada for 46 years, over 2/3 of her life, twice as long as she had lived in the USA. She resided in several cities across the country, beginning in Toronto and Ottawa for a decade, then 2 years in Vancouver, and 2 decades in Winnipeg, and finally 3 years in Victoria. Nevertheless, it was many years after immigrating to Canada before she wrote these words in her poem, Coming to Canada, age 22. It took years to happen, and years before come back soon changed to here and now and a home, the place I came to, the place I was from. Carol Shields had traveled a great distance from coming to Canada to coming from Canada. Her 5 children, however, were all Canadian from the outset. Her claim to being a Canadian writer is based not so much on the years she lived in Canada or even on her achieving Canadian citizenship in 1971, but on her reading and writing. Shields became truly Canadian by first reading Canadian literature and then writing about it. She began with L.M. Montgomery's Anne of Green Gables as a girl and Marian Engels' the Honeymen Festival as a woman. Reading Margaret Lawrence's The Stone Angel inspired her to enroll in a master's program at the University of Ottawa to study Canadian literature, of all things, as she wrote to her family, where she wrote a thesis on Susanna Moodie, the first thesis on Moodie in Canada. Later, she entered the doctoral program, planning to study 19th century Canadian women novelists. But her budding creative writing career, plus raising her 5 children, prevented her from completing her thesis, although she was subsequently awarded 15 honorary degrees. In Writing from the Edge, she declares, "Now I am going to contribute to the nexus of Canadian identity." And she did, claiming, "We have wonderful women writers here in Canada." She compares Canadian and American fiction, as Canadian writing is more community-centered, she says, while American writing focuses on the individual. Quote, "The Canadian, who are we, rather than the American, who am I," as she put it. Carol Shields shared that communal perspective, being revered by her fellow writers for her generosity. Shields wrote several essays about Canadian literature, such as The New Canadian Fiction, and she also wrote 50 book reviews, primarily of novels, avoiding negative reviews that she labeled cruelties because she had received some herself. She said that she avoided showing what she called the glint of the fang. Shields and Winnipeg enjoyed a mutual love affair. One emblematic story shows why Carol and Don Shields took Winnipeg to their hearts. After they ran out of gas on the Pembina Highway on a cold winter night, a city bus pulled up and the driver ordered all able-bodied men aboard to get off and push their car to the nearest gas station. Carol Shields affirmed, "We soon realized that everything was there that we needed or wanted. We had our daily rituals and a huge network of friends. It provided the most complete sense of community that I had known since growing up in the American Midwest." So now she was in the Canadian Midwest. And Winnipeg took Carol Shields to its heart, naming her Citizen of the Year and lavishing her with awards. She didn't just write about Canada, however, she also wrote Canada, setting the Republic of Love in Winnipeg. Guy Vanderhaeg recalls a visit to a Canadian literature class at an American college where students had read the Republic of Love. Some women students said they wanted to move to Winnipeg because they said, "It is such a romantic city. It's the city of love." No wonder Winnipeggers revere Shields for making their city so famous, establishing a hedge maze in her honor based on her novel Larry's Party about Larry Weller, maze maker extraordinaire, plus a bronze bust of the author. Thus, Shields became a Canadian writer through reading Canadian literature and writing about it and writing it. When she won the Marian Engel Award for Lifetime Achievement, she exuded How wonderful to be a woman living and writing in Canada. Although Carol Shields was raised in the era that believed if you can't say something nice, don't say anything at all, applied especially to young women, she was a rebel in life and in literature. And another emblematic event reveals her innate rebelliousness when she gathered with friends in the woods the night before her college graduation in 1957 to stage a ritual burning, not of their brassieres, but of their saddle shoes. They vowed to convocate the next day, not just braless, but stark naked under their convocation robes. She recalls, it was a nose-thumbing rejection of the suffocating shell of convention that enclosed us. But she soon outgrew what she once referred to as the plastic bag of her upbringing. Shields was a border crosser in literature as well as in life. In her talk, Gender Hopping, she discusses writers who switch genders, that is, male writers writing about female heroines and vice versa. Her own first poetry collection was titled Others. She confesses in an interview, my other was men. Perhaps that is why she wrote 2 novels featuring male protagonists, Happenstance and Larry's Party. She also blended genres, mixing poetry, drama, essays, and biography into her fiction. So she is equally rebellious about writing. Surprise keeps us alive, she claims, and she seeks to startle and illuminate readers. She puzzles, I don't know how I came to be so rebellious because I'm not in my everyday life. Initially, she towed the literary line, adhering to rules of genre, coloring within the lines. She says, coloring outside the lines may be harder to accomplish, but can yield more in the end than simple follow the dot transference. She recalls, as a young writer, I was not in the least rebellious. Literary genres seemed to me fixed phenomena governed by established definition. She adds, I suppose it sounds unacceptably naive to say I didn't know rules could be so easily broken. Part of this has to do with being a woman, especially a woman of my generation. That is, a woman who grew up in the post-World War period between first and second wave feminism, like her heroine, Brenda Bowman, protagonist of A Fairly Conventional Woman. Eventually, Shields discovered the excitement of rebellion. In her essay, Writers Are Readers First, she recalls, I saw that I could become a writer if I paid attention, if I was careful, if I observed the rules, and then, just as carefully, broke them. Although she remained an inveterate border crosser, Shields, as her daughter Angie Ardini confirms, is a completely Canadian writer. By writing about her adopted country and its writers, I believe she earned the title The Canadian Shields. So if you want to challenge me, we can debate that in the discussion period. But now I want to give you a sense of the contents of The Canadian Shields. 2 women authors, both friends and fellow writers of Carol Shields, Margaret Atwood and Lorna Crozier, frame this collection of Shields' writing. As Atwood contributed a foreword where she declares that Carol Shields' books are delightful in the original sense of the word, they are full of delights. And Lorna Crozier has contributed an afterword. But most important, The Canadian Shields contains 50 items by Carol Shields herself, 24 previously unpublished stories and essays, and 24 essays previously published in journals and magazines, but never before collected. And actually, I can tell you, and I think Nicholas, who's done a lot of research in the Carol Shields archives, can agree that they're also very difficult to access. So my aim is always to make the work of writers that I admire more readily accessible to readers. And in fact, I dedicated this collection to Carol Shields readers. A border crosser generically as well as geographically, Shields moved between fiction and nonfiction with ease, demonstrating that, like Canada and America, these genres have both similarities and differences. The Canadian Shields Stories and Essays reveals valuable connections between Shields' fiction and nonfiction as her essays illuminate her novels. By comparing her stories and essays, we can better understand her protean gifts. And I'm just going to mention two things in passing. One is the wonderful collection that Carol Shields' daughter, Anne Giardini, and her son, Nicholas Giardini, edited called Startle and Illuminate Carol Shields on Writing. And I'm just going to hold it up here so that you can see it. And then just last year, a dozen Canadian scholars and Carol Shields specialists contributed essays that look at Carol Shields' stories and novels through the lens of her essays. And that is titled Relating Carol Shields' Essays in Fiction, Crossing Borders. And I won't recommend that you buy it because it's absurdly expensive. 125 pounds sterling, if I remember correctly. But you could always encourage your libraries to buy it for you. Okay, where was I? Carol Shields' essays are just as enjoyable as her stories. They vary from personal recollections, such as At Home in Winnipeg, and I've always meant to tell you, A Letter to My Mother, from which Dawn has graciously offered to read a snippet, to cultural items such as the visual arts and the unity of our country. Some of the personal ones include the essay where she asks in the title, did anything happen to you in the 50s? And answers in her opening sentence, high school, university, going abroad, marriage, immigration, the birth of 2 children, that's all. And the next sentence she adds, but even though I lived during the 50s in the much maligned territory of suburbia, I was unaware of belonging to a decade characterized by dullness, blandness, puritanism, and hypocrisy. Others are more focused on more cultural aspects of her interests. When she talks about the unity of our country, for example, she was referring to Canada, which she argues has a distinctive culture of its own and in which she celebrates the Canada Council. When I interviewed her in 2003, she confessed, I was the last feminist to wake up in the world. But wake up she did. In her essay titled Heidi's Conundrum, inspired by Wendy Wasserstein's 1988 play, The Heidi Chronicles, Shields' implicit feminism becomes explicit. Her essay opens with the statement, feminism sailed into the 60s like a dazzling ocean liner, powered by injustice and steaming with indignation. In her essay published in Allure magazine titled A Purse of One's Own, which sounds a bit frivolous, the subtitle, Other Than a Woman's Own Thoughts, a handbag is about the only inviolable space that she possesses, turns what could be a mere fashion statement into a feminist suggestion. Atwood's foreword, in Atwood's foreword, she observes, feminism was something she worked into as she published more widely and came up against more commentators who thought excellent pastry was a facile creation compared with raw meat on skewers, and who in any case could not recognize the thread of blood in her work, although it was always there. Carol Shields embraced her community of Canadian women writers. In her afterword to Drop Threads, What We Aren't Told, she declares, I am honored to be a part of this ongoing project, which locates itself at the juncture of my 2 favorite things, language and the company of women. There we can find courage to go forward in our lives. Fortunately, we are left with Carol Shields' voice expressed in her writing, which conveys her vision. As Atwood affirms in her foreword, and live she did, and live she does. For, as John Keats remarked, every writer has 2 souls, an earthly one and one that lives on in the world of writing as a voice in the writing itself. It's this voice, astute, compassionate, observant, and deeply human, that will continue to speak to her readers everywhere. And now I would like to invite the members of Carol Shields' family and one of her students, beginning with Dawn Shields, to read a few brief quotations from her writings. Dawn, over to you. Can I just mention that Dawn was a professor of engineering and then dean of engineering at the University of Manitoba, where Carol Shields was professor of English and where she taught creative writing.
And she became chancellor of the University of Winnipeg.
I will get to that.
Anywho, yes, I'm honored, and thank you, Nora, for that introduction. I wish I could read it as well as you do. What I want to talk about today, just a little bit, is Carol's contribution, which is called I've Always Meant to Tell You, A Letter to My Mother. Nora has mentioned that in her introduction. And I want to just go back a little bit in time and set up the origin of this story. The story starts when we, the 7 of us, were living on a houseboat on the River Seine at Port Marly, an hour west of Paris. Carol and I talked one day of improving our French language skills. We decided to enroll in a language program in Pau, which is a city in western France, 50 kilometers from Spain. We would spend the month of August in Pau in a rented house. Our Canadian friends, Margaret and Blair Diamond, would be in Pau at the same school at the same time when we would be there. Margaret and Blair had been instrumental in our renting the houseboat in Port Marly. It turned out that Blair and Carol would be in the same French language class as were Margaret and me. As an aside, Poe has an interesting Canadian connection in that Thomas Douglas, the fifth Earl of Selkirk, is buried there. Lord Selkirk was instrumental in bringing Scottish settlers to the Red River Valley in what became Manitoba. So we drove to Poe from Port Marly, a distance of 800 kilometers, in what must be the world's smallest station wagon, a Renault 4L. John, Anne, and Catherine were in the rear seat, while Meg and Sarah were on little rattan chairs in what would normally be the trunk of the car. Our luggage was in the roof rack. We had given family the address of the school if they needed to write to us. I remember clearly when Carol and I found a letter waiting for us to pick up after we had been in Pau for 10 days or so. The letter was from Carol's father, Robert, in Florida, advising us that Carol's mother, Ines, had been diagnosed with colon cancer. The prognosis was dire. Robert went on to say that Ines did not want her children to see her since she had lost so much weight that she was emaciated. Carol was instructed by her father not to fly to America. Carol did not see her mother alive again. So now we pick up the story in Carol's I've Always Meant to Tell You, a letter to my mother. Dear mother, you told me once, I must have been 11 or 12, that my conception was an accident. I suppose I could have been crushed, but I wasn't. The way you said it, the look on your face, and the girlish way you rolled your eyes told me that one of the good accidents of your life was me. It was an easy birth, too. You slipped out like a lump of butter, you used to say. I can't think now why I found this announcement so mortifying. Was it the image of butter or the unimaginable bloody process and that most intimate of connections? You said all kinds of things, and many of these sayings are available on the long playing record inside my head. All I have to do is press a button and your voice comes on. Always give the Salvation Army. They do good work. Never light candles in the daytime, and never have candles on the table if you don't intend to use them. Always buy from the Fuller Brush Company. They're a fine old company. And so it goes on with advice to Carol that she's pushed the button to remember. And there are 13 of them, and I won't read them all, but towards the end, there are a couple of interesting ones. When you make a tailored wool suit or dress, send it out afterwards to be professionally pressed. Feed your husband nutritious meals. That way he will live longer and support you. Carol goes on in her essay to say, I feel needy for your praise. You were uniquely enthusiastic about the awful poetry and stories I wrote as a child. One of these poems began, Spring is here, hurrah, hurrah, come on boys, come out to play. Put on your scarves and hats Grab your baseball and your bats. On and on it went through 4 seasons, yards of it. Never mind. You carefully copied down these execrable words, validating them with the nib of your pen, and thereby demonstrating your belief, the act of creativity, and by extension, the notion that your own child could be a writer. I would have told you how important this was to me, but, and this is what hurts my heart, it is only recently that I have been able to articulate it to myself. You died when I was 35. I was married then and a mother myself. I have only just begun, 25 years after your death, to know who you are and how much I need it. Reach out, touch her hand.
Thank you, Don. That's wonderful. Well, perhaps, and actually, she does use that story about you slipped out like a lump of butter in the first poem called Getting Born, which is the opening of her collection coming to Canada. So
I would like to just to mention another thing that you mentioned,
Mhm.
that is that in the Stone Diaries, there is a moment in time in which Daisy Goodwill, the heroine of the Stone Diaries, is going to meet her mother-in-law to be for lunch. And why I'm talking about the Stone Diaries is that in the Stone Diaries, during the luncheon, Mrs. Hode, the mother-in-law to be, could not resist giving Daisy advice. And in that advice, there's a list of at least 8 or 12 points that she wants to make. By the way, Daisy, it's always preferable to say death rather than passing on or passing away. Salad forks, of course, go outside the dinner. I see you are not eating your olives, Daisy. If you should at any time find something on your plate which is not to your liking, try to avoid giving offense by sliding it under something else. Do we see a similarity between the list in Carol's letter to her mother and the list of Stone Diaries?
Thanks very much, Don. So perhaps Hazel, would you be kind enough to read the segment about what it was like for young American women of your grandmother's age?
I'd love to. Thanks, Nora. Hi, I'm Hazel. I'm the oldest daughter of Carol and Dawn's youngest daughter. And I'm going to read a little excerpt from Coming to Canada. A good many American girls of my generation, the 40s, the 50s, led predictable lives. Off to college if we were lucky, marriage in the weeks following graduation, a baby the next year, a new house even further out in the suburbs, a plunge into menu planning or home sewing, then probably joining the PTA or a symphony auxiliary. An American Idol. What I hadn't counted on was meeting and marrying a young Canadian engineer and spending all my adult life in a different country. That geographical blur at the top of the map, colored always a bright pink to match Rhodesia, Australia, and of course, England, the mother country. That's just a quick excerpt. So yeah, thank you. Thanks, Nora.
Well, thank you very much, Hazel. And I would you like to say anything further? And I also realized that I had invited your cousin Nicholas to introduce you, and I'm sorry I mentioned to do that.
That's all right. I guess I will say, as Nora mentioned, she met me, I think, when I was about 3. And about a year later, unfortunately, is when Carol died. So I don't remember too much of her, but I do feel I know her very well because she absolutely lives through in her grandchildren and children, and in Dawn and Arlette, who work so hard to keep her memory alive. And yeah, I'm incredibly grateful to be a part of her family. And I also know her because I am have been dating my own Manitoban engineer for the last 7 years. So I feel like I get to experience her life a little bit through that. Thanks.
Well, thanks, Hazel. And yes, I don't know if I mentioned this was before people joined us today, but when I went to Victoria in 2003, May 2003, to meet with Carol Shields and interview her, I was greeted at the door by a little girl, about 3 or 4 years old, who said, "Grandma's in the kitchen," and I sort of deduced that that was probably Hazel, and she thinks it probably was. So it was a great pleasure to meet the grown-up Hazel. So thank you for that. And Nicholas, did you want to say anything at this point?
So I was just going to say, so Hazel, to add, so Hazel lives in Vancouver and is currently a medical student at UBC. Before that, she had a research background in neurobiology and mutations and longevity of worms. And she grew up in Victoria, as she mentioned, and has also lived in Montreal and now lives in Vancouver.
Thanks, Nicholas. So I'm going to invite Marjorie DeLuca to read an excerpt. Marjorie had the good fortune to be a student in Carol Shield's final advanced creative writing class at the University of Manitoba, and she went on to become a published author herself who writes historical and contemporary suspense under the pen name M.M. DeLuca. So Marjorie, please take it away. She's going to read an excerpt from Carol Shield's essay titled Parties.
Hi, it's a real pleasure and a privilege to be here. I just have to say before I read, I can vividly remember the first day of Carol's final advanced creative writing class at the University of Manitoba. Carol had just been awarded the Pulitzer Prize for the Stone Diaries, and I remember we all were sitting there, silent, starstruck, as if we were waiting for a rock star to arrive. And in walked this petite, charming, and absolutely humble genius who made us comfortable right from the start with her friendliness and her sense of humor and just absolute warmth. Carol was a teacher, a mentor, and she also became a friend to all of us. We would go out for lunches, and she loved to hear everybody's gossip. She'd say, "Tell me a gossip." And she just loved that. Um, she inspired me to continue with my own writing. And I have a little thing. She signed her copy of a copy of Larry's Party, and her words, she said, "For Marjorie, onward, don't give up." And I didn't give up. And I do owe her a lot. Um, let's take a look at this little excerpt from Parties. Parties begins, who doesn't love a party? All my life, it seems, I've been drawn to the idea of parties, of people gathering together in order to observe an occasion, to celebrate, or simply rub up against each other. She adds, nevertheless, it came as a surprise to me to discover that all of my novels contain party scenes. She concludes, when referring to her favorite party scene from the novel Swan, a Mystery, I am an invisible presence at this gathering, an authorly mouse under a fictional chair, watching Rose's friends come together to share holiday warmth and hospitality, saying to one another as they at last put on their coats and scarves and head for home, thanks so much. It was a wonderful party. And I'm happy to say I did have the pleasure of attending some of Carol's parties, and in particular, the final one at Carol and Don's beautiful apartment on Wellington Crescent. And yes, it was a wonderful party, and she was the consummate hostess. Thank
Thanks
you.
Thanks so much, Marjorie. That was really delightful. And I might add that Carol Shields does include parties in all her novels, and obviously that's something she really enjoyed. Does anybody want to chime in at any point? Feel free. Okay, so I've asked my son Grant Stovel if he would read a short excerpt from the essay that she titled Others. And I had mentioned that her first collection of poetry in 1972 was titled Others. So Grant, I guess there you are, and you've got your quote to read.
Yeah, I'm here. I'm at work at a radio station in Alberta where I have the pleasure of working. I'm not currently on the radio right now, although that would be nice too. But yeah, I'm really thrilled to get a chance to share this. So, this is the portion that I'll be reading. In her essay titled Others, Shields acknowledges what interested me instead of the possibility and need of truly knowing someone was the unknowability of others, their very otherness, in fact. It was apparent to me that members of close, loving families resisted the forces of coercive revelation and that even partners in long, happy marriages remained ultimately strangers to one another. Shields believes men and women are more alike than we think, responding similarly to experience, but perhaps expressing those responses differently. The language of men and women has been differently conditioned by turns covert, self-protecting, flamboyant, abstract, cryptic. The gulf between them is language, not belief.
Thank you, Grant. And she does really dramatize her theories, especially in her happenstance pair of novels. The first one, titled Happenstance, featuring a male protagonist, historian Tom Bowman, and its partner novel featuring a quilter named Brenda Bowman, his wife, titled Originally a Fairly Conventional Woman. So I'm going to read another little quote that's a bit more personal from that same essay titled Others, where Carol Shields says, I suffer, as many writers do, from a scavenger's guilt and always experience a desire to include on the title page of my books some small message of acknowledgement. Forgive me, or I'm sorry. And we may remember that sorry is the magic word in Margaret Lawrence's A Bird in the House. And I mentioned already that she does also acknowledge in another essay, my other was men. And I do think that might have inspired her to write two novels featuring male protagonists.
A little bit to that, Nora.
Yes.
I just wanted to add to the idea that Carol was always interested in gossip and interested in listening to others when we were out. And I remember being out for lunch in Barcelona, believe it or not, while she was on a book tour. And she said to me, just be quiet. Because she said, I'm finding that people on both sides of us are so. And she looked at the left, and there were two women talking to each other, actually, at their table. And one of them was saying to the other woman, you don't understand why my husband is so upset. It was just a little bitty affair. So then she said, as she talked about this, of the two men who were sitting on the other side of us, talking away, and Carol would give talks about what they said, mixing up metaphors. And one of them said to the other, oh, we'll cross that bridge when we get to the bottom of the barrel. So there you have two sources of stories that she loved to tell Abby.
Thanks, Don. And I actually recognize that mixed metaphor. She's written it into one of her essays or interviews. I can't remember exactly where, but that's great. And she does talk about eavesdropping on the bus and also encourages her students to read obituaries for kernels of narrative that might inspire their own narratives. And I'll just mention, by the way, since Grant mentioned his radio station at CKUA, which is Canada's oldest independent radio station. So let's hear it for CKUA. Now I'm going to turn it over to Nicholas to read segments from Carol Shields' wonderful essay, The Healing Journey, which is one of my favorites, one of her most personal. It's a late essay, and it's an essay that I read as a kind of retrospective of her literary career. And then I think he's going to go on and read a related passage from one of her last pieces of writing, her afterword to Drop Threads, what we aren't told. So Nicholas, please go ahead but I think I did mention your book, right? So and also I don't know if I should mention this, but Nicholas just got married this summer. So felicitations to Nicholas and his bride.
Thank you very much, Nora. I grew up very largely on the ferry between Vancouver and Victoria on my way to visit my grandmother throughout her illness and to the end of her life. As a reader of Carol Shields, like so many other people, maybe people in this Zoom call, I read my first Carol Shields story in high school English class. I always knew that she was a writer, but I think I'd always felt too young or daunted to try and read her books with a family connection. But that short story, which was Weather, hooked me. And then I just read on and on and on and on. And here we are today. Okay, so the first excerpt I have is from The Healing Journey. Because I'm a novelist, it has sometimes been useful for me to imagine a life as possessing roughly the shape of a novel. I don't mean that I'm willing to confuse fact with fiction, illusion with reality. I'm talking about the structure of a novel, and particularly the fact that novels fall into chapters, separate chapters in time and space, but chapters which are joined by an overriding narrative line, or what I like to think of as the spine of the story. And the next related piece is from the afterword to Dropped Threads. We move through our chapters mostly with gratitude. Who isn't renewed by startling scenery or refreshed by undreamed of freedoms? Surprise keeps us alive, liberates our senses. I thought for a while that a serious illness had interrupted my chaptered life. But no, it is a chapter of its own. Living with illness requires new balancing skills. It changes everything, and I need to listen to it, attend to it, and bring to it a stern new sense of housekeeping. But I have time for this last exercise. All the time in the world.
Thank you, Nicholas. And Nicholas's brother Joseph has also agreed to read something. So Joseph, would you like to go ahead and read, or Nicholas, do you want to introduce Joseph to us first of all?
I can do a quick introduction. Joe's my older brother and is Carol's first grandchild. Joe is a professor in the Department of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Allegheny College in Meadville, Pennsylvania. Joe has lived in Vancouver, Montreal, and Baltimore, and achieved a PhD from Johns Hopkins University.
Congratulations on that, Joseph.
A few years old at this point. Thanks so much, Nicholas and Nora. Thank you so much for putting this book together, for honoring us all with this event, and for your really dedicated work and sort of in making sure that part of Carol's legacy has been stewarded on. I'm going to read a couple excerpts from a short piece, The Writer's Second Self, which reflects upon the relationship between autobiography and fiction, and the brittle tensions between different forms of generic distinction. It is not the writer who coaxes his work into the narrow confines of genre, and it is not the writer who willingly suspends his disbelief. The writer knows that the self can never be washed out of his storytelling, just as his creative and imaginative impulse can never be separated from his personal history. If one subscribes to the theory that it is not a writer's self which is revealed in his writing, but a sort of second self, then the onus upon him to distinguish between the separate spheres of fiction and autobiography will all but disappear. At the very least, the boundaries will soften to a less arbitrary and more flexible interpretation. It has always been acknowledged that diaries, whether intended for publication or not, reveal that side of a writer which he wishes to reveal, just as one turns his most interesting profile to the photographer's lens. The writers of diaries project themselves as they would prefer to be seen. Of course, some writers may use diaries or memoirs as exploratory machinery, an attempt to understand themselves or the period in which they lived, but these explorations are almost always undertaken with conscious shaping and deliberate selectivity, the writer controlling the direction of the quest and imposing on it his own conclusions. Various approaches to autobiography, too, have become blurred. When does a diary become a memoir? When does a tale based on an actual personal event become reportage or essay or story? The refining of these distinctions may, in the end, be exhausting and futile. Most laborious and futile of all may be the picking apart of the elements of fiction reality, laborious because of an infinite number of statements which must be questioned, and futile because no one but the author will ever be able to settle the question, and even he may find himself helpless in the making of final distinctions. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. That's a wonderful passage, and her studies of the self are so interesting. It's also interesting that in that final sentence, she refers to the writer as male. I don't remember the date of that, because I think later she doesn't use the male pronoun in general. So that's kind of interesting.
And, I didn't go into some of the sections in the essay which actually refer to particular works, but almost none of them are by men. She refers briefly to Hemingway, but otherwise, her references are to Margaret Lawrence, to Margaret Atwood, I think a couple others beside, but
right.
The pronoun doesn't match the content of what she reflects on.
That's a good point. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much to all of you for reading those wonderful selections for us. And we have time now for people who would like to just chime in with comments or questions. So please feel free to do that.
If some of my other grandchildren would like to either read or make a comment, that would be preferred from Hazel, Nicholas.
Wonderful.
And Eli, I see you up there on the screen. Why not? He's there.
Nora, I can introduce Eli if you like, but I don't know, Eli, do you have a reading ready, or are you wanting to sit out?
Nora shared an excerpt with me that I'd be happy to read very briefly.
Did I miss you, Eli? I apologize.
Well, it's quite all right. Perhaps, yeah, I can read this short excerpt that Nora shared with me. My name is Eli. I'm one of Carol's grandchildren, and this is an excerpt from one of her essays. More and more, it seems to me that important, life-giving novels are about the search of an individual for his or her real home. You can go all the way back to Ulysses to see this, or you can look at Stephen Dedalus in Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man, or Emma Woodhouse or Fanny Price from Jane Austen's pen. They are all journeying toward that place called home. Almost inevitably, people are born in the wrong place. They are misassigned, detoured, lost in the dark, and compelled to go forward by that image of home. Thank you, Nora.
Thank you very much, Eli. Yes, I think that's a wonderful passage, and I offered it to Eli because I think it's so central to Carol Shields' thinking, and particularly central to her study of Jane Austen, because she clearly believed that Jane Austen was misassigned in her family, and that her novels are her attempt to create the ideal home that she would have wished to have if that had been possible. And I just would like to say about Hazel that it was such a delight to meet the grown-up woman that who I first met as a 3 or 4-year-old girl. And interesting too that one of your grandmother's most successful stories is titled Hazel, about a heroine of that name. So and then when I was visiting with Carol Shields in May of 2003, Dawn was always very careful to, cherished her very carefully, and was very generous and hospitable, but also was careful not to allow Carol to be overtired. And one day when I was there, they set off to go out to buy little dresses for her granddaughters who were coming to have lunch on Mother's Day, which was the next day. And I'm sure that one of those dresses was for Hazel. So nice to meet you, Hazel. So are there comments from the floor, comments or questions? Please feel free to speak up.
Nora, I wouldn't mind saying just a few words about Carol as a poet.
Yes, please.
So hi everybody, my name is Nella Katrupi. Kudos to Nora for yet another wonderful collection of Carol Shields' works. I am doing some work on some of Carol's poetry, and I'm finding it fascinating that, way back when I read the Swan book, I was impressed, so impressed with the poetry that she included in that. And of course, I think the inspiration came from Pat Loudner, whose story the novel is loosely based on. But she says something in an essay that's included in this collection, The Reader-Writer Arc, about poetry. And anybody who's interested in poetry, I think, would find it really enlightening. First of all, because it shows her personality. She talks about being feeling a little bit disquieted at the thought of being asked by her students to give a definition of poetry versus prose, and that she had convinced her husband, Don, I don't know if he remembers this, to set up some kind of electrical gadget to show poetry as a kind of a flash of lightning, an instantaneous flash versus what did she call it? Some other kind of lighting, which just sort of allows different angles and different aspects to be illuminated. And so it's kind of interesting that she used those tools. But she goes on to say something really interesting at the sort of the end of a long paragraph that follows that little story about her prognostication on poetry. And I'll just read it. It's just a couple of lines. My guess is that poetry will live on as an art form with a small readership as it has today, but that a poem will cease to be a mystery which must be unlocked with a set of specialized critical tools. In other words, it will become what it once was, accessible, meaningful, with all the force of a photo flash. So I do recommend that essay to anybody who's interested in poetry and in Carol's thoughts on poetry.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And I can say that her collected poetry was published in 2001. So it's available with this wonderful photo of her on the cover, if anyone would like to read all of her poetry, which I think a couple of people are interested in translating into Italian and into Chinese. So thank you for that. Are there other comments or questions? Please feel free to speak up. I see Neil Besner there, and I have to say that Neil also has written books or collected, edited collections of books of items on Carol Shields. I've got two here in my hand. Carol Shields, The Arts of a Writing Life, and his Prairie Fire collection. So congratulations, Neil. And I was going to mention that, yes, Neil was, when Carol Shields was Chancellor of the University of Winnipeg, Neil was academic vice president, and they worked together. And coincidentally, Neil also lived in the same building as Carol and Don Shields, so knew them quite well. So thank you for joining us, Neil. I see Wendy Roy. I see Isabel Grundy and Pat Demers. And friends, I see friends. Wendy, would you like to say anything? Judith Ruderman. Hi, Judith. I know Judith is a big fan of, an admirer of Carol Shields. Wendy Roy has written wonderful work on Shields.
Just want to say congratulations, Nora. It's a great book, and I really enjoyed the parts that I've been reading so far. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wendy. Judith, would you like to say anything?
Well, everybody here is either a relative or a specialist. I'm just a fan, also a friend of Nora's from another literary idol of ours. But I just want to say that Carol, bless her heart, she died much too young, but she left us quite a legacy. And I've just been a fan of hers, it seems, forever. And I appreciate all those scholars, including you, Nora, but all the others who are writing on her. And this was a wonderful program. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Judith, and thank you to all of you for joining us. So I hope you all have a wonderful holiday with your families and friends. And a special thanks to Carol Shields' family, to Dawn and Nicholas and Joseph and Hazel and Eli for joining us, and Marjorie for reading. So yes, have a wonderful holiday, and this has been really delightful. Thank you all. Thank you, Sarah. And
Hi, everyone. Here's the book. I'll leave you with this image. Thank you for coming. Thank you for participating. Have a good afternoon.